Today's lesson is on an introduction to decimals. So students will use decimal notation for fractions with denominators 10 and 100, placing decimal 100ths on number lines and order decimal hundredths using a number line. If you haven't yet, please preview the vocabulary on your Power Learning dashboard for this lesson before beginning so that you're familiar with some of the terms we're going to talk about. Let's just start with a review from our last unit that you just finished. So let's begin on your whiteboards. You're going to find the number that makes the fraction equivalent. So here for A, you're going to have to divide because the second one is smaller. So 10 divided by what is equal to 5? Well, 10 divided by 2 is going to give you 5. So what you do to the bottom, you have to do to the top. So 4 divided by 2 is going to give you 2. So we know that 4/10 is also equivalent to 2/5. Now you're going to complete B, C, and D on your whiteboard, and then you're going to resume your screencast for your lesson. So we know that the fraction 1/10 can be represented in various ways. We can represent it as a fraction. We can represent it on a number line. This would be your 1/10. We can also represent it in a picture, one shaded piece of a pie that has 10 pieces in total. So each way means one part out of 10 equal parts. So mathematicians have invented an easier way to write 1/10. This is called decimal notation. So with decimal notation, we can write the fraction of 1/10 as a decimal being 0 decimal with your decimal point 1. The dot is called the decimal point, so mathematicians use decimal notation because it takes up less space on the page and it's easier to write than writing 1/10. So let's look here. If we want to write 2/10, so as a fraction, remember this would look like 2/10 as a decimal, what would this look like? Well, 2/10 would look like 0.2. 3/10 would be 0.3, 5/10 0.5, 7/10 would be 0.7, 8/10 0.8, 9/10 would be 0.9. Now, what if, so the 0 before the decimal point tells you that the number is less than 1. So let's place the decimal tenths on a number line. So if I want to look at 8/10, so I have these numbers 0 to 1. So this would be 1/10. This would be 2, 3, 4. This would be 5/10. And then 10/10 would be your whole. So if I wanted 8/10, well 5, 6, 7, 8. This would be 8/10. So 0.8. 5/10 would be right in the middle for 0.5. 2/10 would be 2 in, so 0.2, and then 7/10 would be found on the 7th spot, so 0.7. Now you're going to use this number line and you're going to write the decimal for each marked point. So if I told you the fraction for here would be 3/10, what would this look like in decimal notation? You're going to write the decimal for these 3 points on your whiteboard, and then you're going to continue your screencast. Now we have various shapes such as circles, squares, rectangles. I want you to represent the various numbers that are given to you in decimal notation by shading the picture. So let's do A together. So I'm just going to grab a crayon here. So if I want to represent 0.2, so my pie is cut into 10 pieces already, so 0.2, I'm going to actually shade in 2 pieces of my pie because we know that 0.2 is the same as saying 2/10. Sorry, I know that's hard to read in the crayon. So if we look at B, we have 0.3. So that means I would have 3 of my 10 cubes shaded in, and as a fraction, this would be 3/10. So if for C I have 0.5, then I'm going to color in 5 of my rectangular bars there that I have. And this fraction would be 5/10. And then if I have 0.6, I'm going to color in 6 squares. So there's 5, Sorry, I know my coloring's not great with my mouse. And then 6. Now you're going to go the other way that we just did. So write the decimal for the shaded part of the picture. So all of these pictures are going to be out of 10. So if we looked at A together before you begin, we know that this would be 8 over 10 as a fraction. What would this be as a decimal? Well, it would be 0.8 because 8 out of the 10 parts are shaded. Now I want you to write the decimal for B, C, and D, and then you're going to resume your screencast. So the fraction 1 over 100 can also be represented in various ways. So we just talked about tenths. Now we're going to talk about hundredths. So for the fraction 1 over 100, we can represent it as a fraction, 1 over 100. We can also say 1/100th, or we can write it in decimal notation as 0.01. And on your hundreds grid, if this is 100 blocks, that would just be 1 block shaded. So how is this different from a tenth that we just talked about? Well, there's 2 digits after the decimal point instead of only 1. So when we deal with place value, we have 0, we have our decimal. This would be the tenths place that we were just talking about, so tenths. And then the next digit here is going to be your hundredths. So it's always 2 decimal places over from the decimal. So how then would you write 2/100ths as a decimal? So if I wanted you to show me 2/100ths, how would you show that? So 2/100ths would be 0.02. Then if I asked you to show me 3/100ths as a decimal, it would be 0.03. Oh, that's what we just talked about. We're going to keep going. So now on your whiteboards, I want you to write the fraction as a decimal. So let's do A together first. So we have 9/100ths. So as a decimal, this would be 0.09 because we're talking about the hundredths. So we need the hundredths place value, which is the second number in. I want you to try B, C, D, and E on your whiteboard, and then you're going to resume your screencast when you're ready. So if we look at this picture, how many tenths are shaded in? Well, we have 1, 2, 3 tenths completely shaded in. Each column that we have is 1/10, and we have 3 columns, so 3 tenths. Then how many hundredths are shaded? So if we counted each of these individual blocks, we would count 10, 20, 30. So we have 30 hundredths shaded. Remember, 1/100ths is 1 cube. Okay. So how would you write 3/10ths as a decimal? It would be written as 0.3. And how would you write 30 hundredths? So we have 30 hundredths as a decimal. It would be 0.30 because we're dealing with 30 hundredths of them. So we now know if the 3/10ths is equivalent to 30 hundredths, that this decimal of 0.3, so 3/10ths has to be equivalent or equal to 30 hundredths. So here's some exercises for you to do. We'll do A together. It says write 2 equivalent fractions and 2 equivalent decimals for the amount shaded. So if we looked at this first picture here for A, we would see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns shaded. So we have 6 tenths shaded, which is the same as saying 60 hundredths. There's 60 little cubes here shaded. If I asked you to write this as a decimal, we would then see that we have 0.6 for the tenths, which is the same as saying 0.60 hundredths. I want you to do B, C, and D on your whiteboard, and then you're going to resume your screencast. So if we look here at this picture, and I ask you, how many hundredths are shaded? Well, we can see that we have each one of these cubes, remember, is a hundredth. So if I counted all these cubes that are shaded here, you would find that 30 of them are shaded. How many tenths are shaded? Well, the tenth would be one whole column. So 10, 1, 2, 3 tenths are then shaded. Now, if I shade two more of these blocks, so say I shade here and here, so now how many hundredths are shaded? Well, we would have 32 hundredths shaded now. So I have 32 hundredths. This is the same as saying 3 tenths, because you have 3 columns, plus 2 hundredths, 2 cubes. So when we break this down, essentially 32 hundredths is the same as saying 3 tenths plus 2 hundredths blocks. Now, here's some exercises for you to complete on your whiteboards, and I've given you some sentence starters. So you're going to describe the fraction shaded as hundredths and tenths and hundredths. So let's do A together. Let's look at how many are here all together. So we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and then 60. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 64 hundredths. How do we break this down? Well, we have 6 tenths because we have 6 full columns. Then we have 4 hundredths left in that next column. So the 64 hundredths is the same as saying 6 tenths plus 4 hundredths. I want you to break down B, C, and D on your whiteboards and then resume your screencast for the next part. So just like there's a ones and a tens place in whole numbers, there's also a tenths place and a hundredths place in decimals. So 68 hundredths is the same as saying 6 tenths, which is in this place value, and 8 hundredths, which would be the second digit in. So the first digit to the right of the decimal point is the number of tenths, and the second digit is the number of the hundredths. So you're going to describe the hundredths in 3 ways. You're going to describe it as a fraction, as tenths and hundredths, and then as a decimal. So let's do A together, and then you can do B and C on your whiteboards. So if we look at 54 hundredths, well, this is the same as writing 54 over 100. It's the same as saying 5 tenths and 4 hundredths. And it's also the same as saying 0.54. Now I want you to do B and C on your whiteboards and then resume your screencast. So we can change a decimal written in tenths to one written in hundredths by writing a 0 to the right of the decimal. So for example, we have 4 tenths, which is the same as writing 40 hundredths. If we have 9 tenths, it's the same as writing 90 hundredths. So what this would look like is 0.9 would equal 0.90 for 90 hundredths. Now here's some exercises for you to complete on your whiteboard. You're going to write both decimals as hundredths. Which one is greater? So then you're going to compare the two. Let's do A together. So we have 5 tenths. It's the same as writing 0.50 hundredths and 0.42 hundredths. So we know that 50 hundredths is greater than 42 hundredths. I want you to now do B and C on your whiteboards and then resume your screencast. So let's look at 2 ways to find 43 on the number line. So we can first count 4 tenths, and so we could go 1, 2, 3, 4 tenths, and then 3 more hundredths, so 1, 2, 3, and that would be your 43 hundredths. Or we could count 43 hundredths by counting 10 hundredths, 20 hundredths, 30 hundredths, 40 hundredths, and then adding another 3 hundredths to get to 43 on the number line. So now here's some exercises. You're going to write the fraction of the distance from 0 to 1 as hundredths and as tenths and hundredths. So for example, we have A, which would be 9 hundredths. So we have 9 hundredths, which is equal to 0 tenths and 9 hundredths. Now I want you to do B, C, and D on your whiteboard and then